But it's interesting that indigenous intellectual property rights don't have this kind of legal protection. Okay, so a lot of the things we've been seeing, like the yok-dok weaving, those aren't governed really by any kind of secure protection. And it's actually quite rare to find it. And the only place that I'm aware of where indigenous IPR has been recognised and has been given legal protection is in New Zealand, where they've developed what they call the Toi Iho trademark, which is developed by artists who are working in New Zealand. And it's a way of really saying that, look, this is my cultural property, this is my artistic talent, and this is exclusively Maori, and you can't use it, okay? It's ours, this belongs to us. So I think it's really quite interesting, and I think this is something, again, that we need to ask our communities about, because they have to try to gain this control about rights management for themselves. So they need to manage their own cultural, intellectual property. This is really necessary, or especially necessary, when it becomes digital content, already gathered by institutions of social memory. So those institutions might be a university, which is doing research, or it might be a museum in which you are working, okay? And Kate was talking about this problem, this issue of remix, gathering digital content about cultural and intellectual property and then reusing it in a different format. So we need to think about how we deal with those kinds of things in our research and the appropriate ways in which to deal with them in our museums. What do codes of ethics tell us about all these issues to do with rights then? ICOM has its own code of ethics. And if you haven't seen ICOM's code of ethics and you work in a museum, you should read it. You should know all about it. Because this actually sets some standards by which you should be working, particularly when it comes to working with communities and developing things like participation. So if you're working with a contemporary community or its heritage, then your decisions need to be based on informed and mutual consent without exploitation of the owner or informants. Respect for the wishes of the community involved should be paramount. Okay, so this is a really useful guideline. One of the things which has been discussed a lot in Western museums is this question of the ownership and particularly the exhibition of human remains. Okay, and that has been widely debated within the community, and ICOM has written a great deal about it. And in many museums that I've been involved in, we've actually been taking all human remains off display. Okay, and certainly there has been a big move to for the restitution of human remains in particular to their communities of origin. So hence my dinosaur actually saying, stop displaying my dead ancestors' bones in the dinosaur exhibit. It also, ICOM's Code of Ethics talks about funding community facilities. So if you're talking to contemporary communities, their interests shouldn't be compromised by the fundraising that you do. So if you get fundraising from a big corporation, what sort of contexts are you working, and do you have to be very careful about the way in which the money you're used is actually utilized? So it also talks about the use of collections from contemporary communities. So this requires respect for human dignity and the traditions and cultures that use such material. Such collections should be used to promote human well-being, social development, tolerance and respect by advocating multisocial, multicultural, and multilingual expression. So again, this comes down to questions of communication, participation, involvement with local communities. And the idea of indigenous approaches to curation, the idea of community practice and democratization. So all these things ICOM is stressing is important. The Museums Association in the United Kingdom also has its own code of ethics. And you'll find actually that in many countries that have got a very strong association of museums, that they also have their own codes of ethics. And again, they give us very useful guidelines by which museums should be working. So consult and involve communities, users and supporters, acquire items honestly and responsibly, safeguard the long-term public interest in the collections, and recognize the interests of people who made, used, owned, collected, or gave items in the collections. These are sort of standard practices by which all museums should work. Support the protection of natural and human environments, but research, share, and interpret information related to collections, reflecting diverse views. So in other words, listen to all the people around you who may have very, very different views to those of your own. So this is a strange, intangible practice that we have at Christmas time. Okay, this is Santa and his elves. And these are the elves' views, really, about the situation they're in at the time. And they're not being listened to. So listen to your communities, I suppose, is the key point here. The American Association of Museums also has a code of ethics, but it doesn't really sort of do much to help us, really. It does talk a lot about material culture. So museum collections and exhibitions represent the world's natural and cultural commonwealth. And it talks about stewardship and appreciation and preservation and the fact that we need to recognize the value of all these materials. What's really interesting, I think, in all these sort of ethical codes that have been developed by ICOM and national associations of museums, that very few of them, as yet, refer very strongly to intangible cultural heritage. So I think this is something that has got to change and something that is gradually already changing. Certainly we saw it in ICOM's definition of what a museum is, because it now includes ICH, whereas previously it didn't. And what it seems to me is that ICH and indigenous intellectual property rights are implicit, but they're not explicit. They're not accurately and they're not actually stated in detail. But one organization has been quite active in terms of looking after IIPR, and that is WIPO, W-I-P-O, which I think many of you will have heard of, the World Intellectual Property Organization. And this is one route by which some indigenous cultures have been able to think about protecting their own culture and what they might do with it. And WIPO have produced these two guides, one relating to Australian indigenous collections, one relating to Maori collections, which are available. And they're really quite useful consultation documents, and they give us a way into these things.